In the autumn of 2011, after the driest summer in 94 years, Elias Thorne's 400 acres of corn yielded what amounted to 403 acres of grain. The man from the bank, a young man with a sharp haircut and a degree in agricultural finance, didn't understand the math. He looked at the settlement sheet from the co-op, then at his own projections based on county-wide drought devastation, and shook his head. The numbers did not align with the known facts of the world. It wasn't until Elias's grandson, Ben, took him to the edge of the harvested field and pointed to the churned, dark, loamy earth that the banker began to grasp a truth that had nothing to do with machinery or futures markets. The truth had cost $15,000, came with 4 legs and a snout, and had been, for the previous 18 months, the subject of unending laughter in the 3 counties that touched Elias Thorne's land. Let me tell you about that land. It wasn't the best land in Boone County, Iowa. Not by a long shot. It was 480 acres total, with 400 of it tillable, sitting on a slight, almost imperceptible rise that the Thorne family had called, for 120 years, simply the ridge. The soil was mostly clarion loam, good black dirt, but generations of plowing and planting corn on corn, and later corn on bean, had taken a toll. By the time Elias Thorne took it over from his father in 1956, at the age of 17, a hardpan had formed about 8 inches down. It was a dense, compacted layer of clay and silt that water struggled to penetrate. In a wet year, the fields stayed soggy on top, the roots drowning. In a dry year, the rain that did fall tended to sheet off into the ditches, and the soil above the hardpan would bake into something resembling a terracotta plate. Elias's father, Samuel, had fought it with a subsoiler, a great and terrible shank of steel dragged behind a John Deere Model R that burned 8 gallons of diesel an hour to break up that compaction. It worked for a season. But the weight of the tractors, the planters, the sprayers, the combines, year after year, the pressure from above simply reformed the problem below. It was an expensive, fuel-hungry, and temporary solution to a permanent problem. Elias knew this because he had his grandfather's ledger. The ledger was bound in cracked brown leather, its pages filled with the elegant, looping cursive of a man born in 1878. Josiah Thorne had started the ledger in 1901, the year he bought the final 160-acre parcel that made up the ridge. He didn't just record expenses and profits. He recorded the weather, the date the geese flew south, the depth of the frost, the price of a bushel of corn versus the price of a side of bacon. And he wrote about the hogs. From 1901 until 1948, there were always hogs on the ridge. Not in confinement buildings but out on the land. After the corn was harvested, Josiah would turn 100 head of Tamworths and Chester Whites into the fields to glean the cobs and stalks. They would spend the winter rooting, digging, turning the soil with their powerful snouts, searching for grubs and roots. They aerated the soil. They broke up the compaction. Their manure, rich in nitrogen and carbon, was incorporated directly into the earth. Josiah wrote in an entry dated October 1934, "In the heart of the Dust Bowl, corn is poor but the ground is alive. Hogs keep it honest." Elias, who was 72 years old in the spring of 2010, had read that line 1,000 times. He was a quiet man, known for 2 things: the immaculate condition of his 20-year-old John Deere 9600 combine and his habit of standing at the edge of his fields for long stretches, doing nothing but watching. His posture was permanently stooped from a lifetime of labor, but his eyes were clear. He had farmed the ridge for 55 years, and he understood its rhythms in a way that could not be taught in a university. He knew the low spot in the west quarter that held water 2 days longer than anywhere else. He knew the patch of sandy loam near the old oak where the corn always tasseled first. He knew the sound the soil made when it was thirsty. This deep, earned knowledge was now in direct conflict with the wisdom of the modern age, an age embodied by his grandson, Ben. Ben was 24, freshly graduated from Iowa State with a degree in agronomy. He loved his grandfather, but he saw the ridge not as a living entity with a history, but as an underperforming asset. He had spreadsheets. He had satellite imagery showing yield variations. He had data from the university's test plots proving that a new hybrid seed, combined with a precise application of a specific fungicide and 210 units of nitrogen, could boost yields by 12%. His gospel was efficiency. And efficiency in the spring of 2010 demanded a new combine. Their John Deere 9600 was a legend, but it was a relic. It had a 25-foot grain head. It took Elias and Ben nearly 10 days to harvest their 400 acres of corn. The new machines, the John Deere S-Series combines, were technological marvels. They had 40-foot heads. They could harvest the entire farm in 4 days. They had GPS-guided autosteer that was accurate to within an inch, minimizing overlap and saving fuel. They had on-the-go yield mapping that generated data Ben could use to create his variable rate fertilizer prescriptions. It was the key, Ben argued, to unlocking the farm's true potential. It was the next logical step. It was progress. The man who came to sell them this progress was named Marcus Cole. He was 45 years old, had been the top salesman at the regional John Deere dealership for 7 years running, and was known for his unshakable confidence. He wore a crisp, green and yellow polo shirt and carried an iPad. He didn't sell equipment, he sold solutions. He sat at the Thorne's heavy oak kitchen table, the same table Josiah had built in 1902, and laid out the case. Elias, Ben, he began, his voice smooth and reasonable. The 9600 has been a great machine for you. Nobody's questioning that. But the window for harvesting is getting tighter every year. The weather is more unpredictable. You leave that corn in the field one extra week waiting for a custom harvester or fighting with a smaller machine. A big wind comes through, you could lose 10, 15 bushels to the acre. On 400 acres, he tapped his iPad. You're looking at a potential loss of over $30,000 in a single afternoon. The S780 isn't an expense. It's insurance. He swiped through a presentation. Photos of the gleaming green machine, specifications, testimonials from other farmers. The price was $750,000. With their $9,600 as a trade-in, valued generously at $50,000, the final financed amount would be $700,000. The annual payment would be just over $110,000 for 7 years. Ben was nodding along, his eyes alight. He had already run the numbers. With the increased efficiency, the fuel savings, and the projected 5% yield bump from more timely harvesting, the machine would, on paper, pay for itself. It was tight, but it was doable. It was the way forward. Elias said nothing. He just sat there, his large, calloused hands resting on the oak table. He was looking at Marcus Cole, but his mind was on his grandfather's ledger. He was thinking about the entry from 1934. Hogs, keep it honest. Grandpa, Ben said, his voice gentle but firm. We have to do this. Everyone is scaling up. The margins are too thin to stay small. We can't compete using 20-year-old tech. It wasn't a question of competition, Elias thought. It was a question of resilience. For 50 years, he had watched the prevailing wisdom change. Get big or get out. Fence row to fence row. More horsepower, more chemicals, more debt. Each step promised security and delivered fragility. Each solution created a new, more complex problem. The new seeds were incredible, but they required more nitrogen. The new herbicides were effective, but they created resistant weeds. The new combines were efficient, but their weight, 80,000 pounds fully loaded, was crushing the very soil they were meant to harvest, recreating the hardpan his father had fought with the subsoiler. It was a cycle of ever more expensive inputs, all financed by the bank, all dependent on the weather and the price of corn, neither of which a farmer could control. He looked at Marcus, then at his grandson. The payment is $110,000 a year. It was a statement, not a question. That's right, Marcus said, smiling. But the return on investment is solid. We project. Elias held up a hand, a gesture that silenced the room. For 7 years. Yes, standard financing term. Elias nodded slowly. So for 7 years, the first 2,000 bushels of corn from every 100 acres goes to the bank. Before I pay for seed, before I pay for fertilizer, before I pay for fuel, before I pay myself. The first cut belongs to the machine. Ben shifted in his chair. That's one way to look at it, I guess. It's the only way to look at it, Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the small kitchen. "We're not just buying a machine. We're selling the first part of our harvest for 7 years. We're betting that the price of corn will stay high and the rain will fall at the right time." "That's a big bet." Marcus Cole's smile tightened. He had heard this before, this old-timer reluctance. It was an emotional obstacle, not a logical one. "Elias, every farm in this county runs on debt. It's the cost of doing business. You can't let fear of a payment stop you from making a smart investment in your operation's future." Fear, Elias thought. It wasn't fear. It was memory. He remembered 1983, the drought and the PIK program. He remembered 1998, when corn hit $150 a bushel and men he'd known his whole life lost their land. He had survived because his father had taught him one rule: don't owe the bank for anything that can't survive a hailstorm. You could borrow for land because the land would always be there. You did not borrow for iron because iron rusts, breaks, and becomes obsolete. It was a rule from another era, an era Ben and Marcus could not comprehend. The conversation went on for another hour. Ben made his case with data. Marcus made his with financial projections. Elias listened. When they were finished, he stood up and walked to the sideboard where the old ledger was kept. He brought it back to the table and opened it. The pages were yellowed and brittle. He didn't point to a specific line. He just placed his hand on the open book. "The problem isn't in the harvest," he said, his voice low. "It's in the ground." Ben sighed. "Grandpa, our soil is fine. We test it every year. The pH is balanced. The P and K levels are good. The soil is dead," Elias said, cutting him off. It was the harshest Ben had ever heard him speak. "We treat it like a factory floor, a medium to hold the seed and the chemicals. But it's supposed to be alive. And it's dying. That hardpan is worse than it was in my father's day. The water doesn't soak in. The organic matter is down to 2%. It used to be 5-inch," he tapped the ledger. "It says so right here." Marcus Cole saw his sail slipping away. "Elias, we have technology for that now. GPS-guided deep rippers, vertical tillage tools. We can break up that compaction for you. We can even roll that into the financing package." Elias looked at the salesman, a deep sadness in his eyes. He saw a man who had a tool for every problem, but no understanding of the system itself. A man who would sell you a new lung while ignoring the poison in the air. He closed the ledger. "The answer isn't more iron," he said. 2 days later, the talk of the Boone County feed and seed was Elias Thorne. He had walked into the First National Bank, the same bank that had pre-approved the $700,000 loan for the combine, and secured a different loan. It was for $15,000. The next day, he drove his old Ford F-250, not to the John Deere dealership, but 150 miles east to a heritage breed livestock auction. Ben refused to go with him. He was angry and embarrassed. His grandfather was throwing away their future, turning his back on progress for some nostalgic fantasy. Elias came back that evening with a stock trailer carrying 50 Tamworth gilts. They were a beautiful breed, long-legged and lean, with coats the color of burnished copper. They were known for their hardiness, their foraging ability, and their active, curious nature. They were, in a word, rooters. He put them in the North 40, a field that had just come off soybeans and was scheduled for corn the following spring. He fenced it with temporary electric wire. He provided a simple 3-sided shelter and a water tank. Their feed was the residue from the previous crop, the weeds, the insects, and a small daily ration of cracked corn he provided to keep them trained to his call. The laughter started almost immediately. It wasn't malicious, not at first. It was the bewildered chuckle of men who thought their neighbor had finally lost his mind. "Here Elias is getting back into the hog business," they'd say over coffee at the co-op. "Guess he's tired of making money." His neighbors, men like Dale Jansen who farmed 2,000 acres with 2 brand new S780s, would slow their pickups as they drove past Elias's farm. They'd see the old man out there, moving his temporary fence every few days. The red hogs scattered across the field, and they would just shake their heads. It looked like a scene from 100 years ago. It looked inefficient. It looked poor. Marcus Cole heard the news and made one last visit. He found Elias leaning on a fence post, watching the hogs. "Elias," he said, his tone one of genuine concern. "It's your farm. You can do what you want. But I have to tell you, you're making a mistake. There's no money in a setup like this. The feed conversion ratio is all wrong. You're exposing them to parasites. A modern confinement barn." Elias let him talk. He watched as one of the gilts used her flat, powerful snout to flip over a chunk of sod the size of a dinner plate, exposing a tangle of roots and a fat white grub, which she devoured with a satisfied grunt. He watched her dig deeper, her snout working like a shovel, breaking up the compacted soil. When Marcus paused for breath, Elias pointed with his chin at the rooting sow. "She's working for me for free," he said. "She's tilling the soil. She's aerating it. She's fertilizing it. And when she's done, I'll sell her for more than I paid for her." "What's the feed conversion ratio on that?" Marcus had no answer. He got in his truck and drove away. He didn't come back for a long time. Ben was mortified. His friends from college would call, asking about the new combine he'd been so excited about. He'd have to explain that his grandfather had bought pigs instead. Pigs, like a homesteader. He avoided the co-op. He took his meals in his room. He loved his grandfather, but he felt a burning shame. All his plans, all his spreadsheets, all his modern knowledge, it had been dismissed in favor of a 100-year-old entry in a dusty book. Let me tell you what the hogs did to that land over the next 18 months. Elias rotated them across all 400 acres of his cropland. After harvest, they would go on to the corn stubble, cleaning up spilled grain and turning the stalks into the soil. In the spring, they would work the fields that were going into soybeans. They were a constant, living presence on the land. Their rooting was not like the violence of a subsoiler. A steel shank rips through the soil, fracturing it. The hog snouts lifted, turned, and crumbled it. They weren't just breaking up the hardpan. They were mixing the layers of the soil profile. They brought clay up and took carbon down. Their manure, deposited directly onto the field, was not the sterile, high-salt chemical fertilizer that farmers bought in bags. It was a complex, living substance, full of organic matter and microbes. The earthworms returned first. Elias would walk the fields behind the hogs and see their castings everywhere, a sign that the soil was breathing again. The structure of the soil began to change. Instead of being made of fine, separate particles, it began to aggregate, to form little clumps. This is the holy grail of soil health. These aggregates create pore spaces, tiny channels and reservoirs in the soil. When it rained, the water no longer sheeted off into the ditch. It soaked in. The soil became a sponge. Elias didn't need a soil probe to know this. He could feel it in the soles of his boots. The ground had a spring to it that it hadn't had in 60 years. Ben saw it too, though he was reluctant to admit it. In the spring of 2011, as he was making a pass with the planter, he noticed he could drive a full gear faster than the year before. The planter's discs sliced into the soil with less effort. The tractor's engine didn't lug as hard. It was a small thing, a saving of a few gallons of diesel, but it was a measurable difference. He didn't say anything to Elias. That spring was wet, unusually so. On Dale Jansen's farm, his vast, flat fields were pocked with standing water. His brand-new equipment sat idle, the ground too saturated to work. On the ridge, Elias's fields were different. The rain fell, and it vanished into the earth. They were able to get their corn planted a full week before their neighbors. It was another small advantage. And then the rain stopped. June 2011 was dry. July was a furnace. August was a memory of what rain felt like. From June 1st to August 31st, Boone County received 47 inches of rain. The 100-year average was 121 inches. The temperature hovered above 95 degrees for 34 consecutive days. It was the kind of summer that broke farmers. By mid-July, the corn in the surrounding fields was showing the stress. The leaves were rolling up into tight, spiky tubes during the day, a desperate effort to conserve moisture. By early August, the lower leaves were firing, turning brown and brittle from the bottom up. The tassels, when they emerged, were sparse and shed their pollen in a single, desperate morning before being scorched by the sun. It was a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. Dale Jansen flew a drone over his 2,000 acres. The images came back in shades of pale green, yellow, and brown. He stood with his agronomist looking at the data. "We need to start thinking about chopping it for silage," the agronomist said. "The kernels aren't going to fill. We can at least salvage some tonnage for feed." The thought of harvesting 0 bushels of grain from a multimillion-dollar investment was a physical pain. On the ridge, Elias's corn was different. It wasn't thriving, not in that heat, but it was surviving. The leaves were still open late into the afternoon. The color was a deeper, healthier green. The soil, that living sponge he and the Hogs had been building, was holding onto the moisture from the spring rains, rationing it out to the roots, drop by precious drop. The organic matter, which had risen from 2% to nearly 28% in just 18 months, was acting like a savings account for water. Every 1% increase in soil organic matter allows an acre of land to hold an additional 20,000 gallons of water. Elias's 400 acres had a reserve of 16 million gallons of water that his neighbor's land did not. His corn was drinking from a deeper well. Ben saw it all. He walked the fields every evening. He would dig into the soil with his bare hands. A few inches down, below the dry, dusty surface, the earth was still cool and moist. He would cross the fence line into Dale Jansen's field. The ground there was hard, cracked, and bone-dry as far down as he could dig. For the first time, the spreadsheets and the data from his textbooks seemed like a foreign language describing a world that did not exist. His grandfather's world, the world of the ledger and the Hogs, was the one that was real. The harvest began in late September. It was a somber affair across the county. Yields were devastatingly low. Farmers who had budgeted for 200 bushels to the acre were getting 90. Some were getting 60. Insurance adjusters were busy. The mood at the co-op was funereal. Elias and Ben fired up the old 9600. Its engine sounded loud and clumsy compared to the quiet hum of the new machines, but it worked. As the first ears of corn were pulled into the header, Ben watched the yield monitor. A simple digital readout Elias had installed years ago. The number that flashed up was 165. He thought it must be a mistake, a calibration error.
165 bushels per acre.
It wasn't possible. The county average was struggling to break 100. He had the combine stop. He got out, pulled a dozen ears from the row, and shelled them by hand. The kernels were small, lighter than in a good year. But they were there. The cobs had filled all the way to the tip. He climbed back into the cab, his heart pounding. They ran for 10 days, the old combine chugging along, a tortoise in a world of hares. Every day the numbers held. Some parts of the fields were better, some worse, but the average stayed stubbornly high. Dale Jansen, harvesting with his 2S780S, finished his 2,000 acres in a week. His final average was 98 bushels to the acre. He had lost a fortune. The decisive moment for Elias Thorne did not happen in the field. It happened at the grain elevator at the co-op. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Ben was driving the grain truck. Elias rode with him. When they pulled onto the scale, the operator, a man named Gary who had known Elias for 40 years, leaned out of the window. "Tough year, Elias," he said, his voice full of sympathy. Elias just nodded. They unloaded the corn, the last load from the last field. Ben drove the empty truck back onto the scale to get the tare weight. He went inside the office to get the ticket. Gary was frowning at the computer screen. He re-entered the numbers. He checked the scale's calibration certificate, which was pinned to the wall. "Something ain't right," he said. He printed the ticket and handed it to Ben. Ben looked at the piece of paper. It was covered in numbers. Moisture content, 162%. Test weight, 55 pounds per bushel. Gross weight, tare weight. But it was the number at the bottom that mattered. The number that represented the sum of a year's work, of a 100-year-old idea, of a quiet man's stubborn faith in a living system over a mechanical one. Total bushels, 66,240. They had 400 acres of corn. The math was simple. 66,240 divided by 400 is 1,656. The yield monitor had been right. Ben walked out to the truck, his hands trembling slightly. He handed the ticket to his grandfather. Elias looked at it for a long moment. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't smile. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply looked at his grandson. And in that look Ben understood everything. The wisdom of the ledger, the purpose of the Hogs, the difference between a price and a value. The news traveled the way all news does in a small town, quickly and with a touch of disbelief. At first, people assumed Elias had a pocket of land that had caught a lucky stray thunderstorm. But the Weather Service data showed the ridge had received exactly the same amount of rain as everyone else. The difference wasn't in the sky. It was in the ground. Dale Jansen was the first to come by. He drove his pristine Ford F-350 down the Thorne's gravel lane and found Elias mending a fence. He didn't get out of the truck for a long time. He just sat there, looking at the harvested cornfield. It didn't look like his fields, which were a carpet of shredded, uniform residue left by his expensive tillage equipment. Elias's field was lumpy, uneven, churned up by the hogs that were already back out, gleaning what the combine had missed. It looked messy. It looked alive. Finally, he got out. He was a big man, accustomed to being in charge, but he seemed diminished. "Elias," he said, his voice raspy. "Gary told me your number." I don't understand it." Elias stopped his work. He looked at Dale, a man he had known since they were boys. A man who had everything the modern world said a farmer should want. And a man who was on the verge of bankruptcy. "Your corn ran out of water, Dale," Elias said. "Of course it ran out of water. We had 4 inches of rain all summer." "I know," Elias said. "Mine ran out of water too. It just ran out 3 weeks later than yours." And in that simple sentence was the entire story. 3 weeks. In the life of a corn plant during grain fill, 3 weeks is an eternity. It was the difference between a nubbin and a harvest. Those 3 weeks had been purchased for $15,000 and the laughter of his neighbors. Dale Jansen's harvest had been insured by a $750,000 machine that couldn't make it rain. Elias Thorne's harvest had been insured by 50 red hogs and the living soil they created. The official county average yield for corn in 2011 was finalized at 102 bushels per acre. Elias Thorne's was 1656. His 400 acres had produced 66,240 bushels. At the county average, 400 acres would have produced 40,800 bushels. Elias had harvested an extra 25,440 bushels of corn. At the then current price of $650 per bushel, that was an additional $165,360 of gross income. It was more than enough to have made the first payment on the new combine. But he didn't have the payment. He had the money, and he had his 50 hogs, which had grown and farrowed, and were now a herd of nearly 200. The final calculation was the one that stuck. The one people talked about for years. The extra 25,440 bushels he grew was the equivalent of the entire harvest from another 250 acres of his neighbor's drought-stricken land. But the phrase that caught on was simpler, more poetic. It was rooted in the visual truth of the land itself. His 400 acres had not just produced more. The land itself felt deeper, richer, more substantial. It held more life. It held more water. It held more value. It was as if the farm itself had grown. They said that the rooted field held 3 more acres. It wasn't a precise agronomic calculation. It was a statement of truth. The aftermath unfolded slowly, over years. Ben Thorne did not go back to his spreadsheets. Instead, he took over the notations in his great-grandfather's ledger. He started a new section, titled Hogs 2010. He recorded their feed, their rotations, their effect on the soil. He became an expert not in the chemistry of fertilizer, but in the biology of the earth. When Elias passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 88, Ben was 40 years old, married with 2 children of his own. The farm was debt-free. The The soil organic matter was 42%. The herd of Tamworth hogs was famous throughout the state. Ben never bought a new combine. He just kept the old 9600 in immaculate condition. Marcus Cole's dealership was consolidated with two others in 2015. He was offered a regional management position, but he turned it down. The last anyone heard, he was selling agricultural real estate. He specialized in helping farmers transition to more regenerative, integrated systems. He never tried to sell a man a machine he didn't need again. The story of Elias Thorne and his hogs became a quiet legend. It wasn't about getting rich. It wasn't about being smarter than everyone else. It was about a different kind of accounting. It was about understanding that a farm is not a factory. It is a living system, complex and interconnected. It is a partnership between a farmer and a piece of land, a partnership that spans generations. The tools of that partnership are not always made of steel. Sometimes they have a snout and a curly tail. What is rigid breaks under pressure? The system of high horsepower, high input, high debt agriculture was rigid. It was incredibly productive in a good year, but brittle in a bad one. Elias Thorne chose a different path. He chose a system that was flexible, resilient, and alive. He chose to invest in the health of his soil, not the efficiency of his harvest. The laughter of his neighbors was the price of that choice. The extra 25,440 bushels of corn in the year of the Great Drought was its reward. What survives is not always what is strongest or fastest. What survives is what adapts. And sometimes, the most radical adaptation is a return to a wisdom that was never lost, only forgotten. A wisdom kept safe in the pages of an old book, waiting for someone to have the courage to read it.